So, we're very excited that Paul's going to do this. He and I have been planning it and looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you are. And so I'm going to turn it over to him. He's got at least 4 weeks here, 5 if he needs it, in October. So I'm encouraging you to stick with it. And also, I know we got some people that couldn't come tonight, so we're going to record it. So it'll be recorded, and you know that it'll be available, but don't let that keep you from coming. Because if you're like me and you say, I'll just get the recording, I never get the recording. So come and enjoy it. It's always better in person. So Paul, how about you?
So, I in the spring of 2017, I had a bunch of stuff going on in my life, and I had to do, and I just fixated on it. So to stop I'll sit down there. So in 2000, the spring of 2017, I had a bunch of stuff going on in my life, and I would just obsess on it, just crazy. And so I had to come up with something to take my mind off of these things. And so you can get audiobooks and the one that I use is called audible.com. And I thought, well, what am I deficient in, right? So at the time, the musical Hamilton was going. So I read the book about Hamilton. It was extremely interesting, and then that led me to like Washington, then it led me to Jefferson. Then I started thinking, my education was really not that good, so then I went and did all the Caesars, and after I did them, I did Alexander the Great, and then when I started, I did Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan is the reason I'm here tonight. And I'll show you why in a minute. So anyway, so I've been going through all these books, and some of them are really long. Some of them are like 30 hours, and some are 15. And I was in like a spot where I couldn't find any books, and this book that you're looking at right there is by N.T. Wright. And I looked at it and I go, I'm not going to do that. But then I noticed that it was on the New York Times bestseller. And I still didn't want to do it because I never liked reading Paul. He drives me crazy. And when you get into who Paul is, he's hard. He's not easy. And he was an extreme intellectual. And I put him up against any philosopher. So anyway, I went, I'll try it. And so I listened to the book about Paul, and this was written for people who, it wasn't written as a scholarly project, it was written as a biography, so a layperson can understand Paul. And so I listened to it once, and X number of hours, and then I listened to it again, then I listened to it again, then I bought the hardback, and I just became obsessed. And I kept bugging Steve about, I need to teach this course, and I don't know that he gets why I need to teach the course. I need to teach the course, so I stopped. I mean, I was working on it today, and it's just consuming. And a weird thing, I was in Austin last week having dinner with somebody, and this guy wrote his doctorate thesis, and part of it was on Paul. We started talking about Paul. So that leads me to what you're looking at right now. That's the book, and that's why I got into the project. And I used this book as an outline, and then after going through it 4 times, I had questions, and I have to know, is N.T. Wright right? So then I'd have to go to other sources, and I've even been listening to lectures Last night I listened to a lecture from somebody from Dallas Theological Seminary, and he talks about N.T. Wright and other people. And as I dove into it, and this is kind of a sensitive thing, so I'll keep looking at Steve to make, if I get one of these from Steve, I know it's, you know, stop. When you think about first century Jews, or let's just make it first century Jews or Gentiles who had the Christ experience, what they, or especially with the Jews, what they were looking for and what we interpreted today are two different things. They're talking about the kingdom of heaven coming to earth. And like if we talk about it, it's like, well, you believe in Jesus, you're not going to go to hell, you can go to heaven. They weren't thinking like that. And there's a whole story behind this whole heaven coming to earth thing, and we're going to get into it. So, if you will go to the back of your handouts, there's an appendix, and I think it's on page 57. Now, the first appendix item is called Timeline of the Apostle Paul. And this is really good. It basically tells you, you know, when he was born, and it gives you dates of significant events that take place in his life. And it also tells you what's going on with the rest of the world at the same time. So this is really good, and one thing you're going to notice as we go through this, all the dates are different. If I rely on the Dallas Theological Seminary, their dates are this. If I rely on, you know, somebody else, their dates are this. But we can generally agree on a general time frame of when things took place. So that's a very interesting thing, and just a good thing to have about the significant things that happened in Paul's life and when it happened, and so on and so forth. Now, if you go to page 64, I'm going to tell you a story. The oldest scroll of, say, the Torah that existed prior to 1947 was about something that they had found that was dated, say, 1000 AD, ballpark, 1000 AD. So you asked why. The Jews would use scrolls, and then when they were used up, they buried them. So they disappeared. So the only one they had was one that was 1,000 years old. Then some Bedouin boys are fooling around in a place called Qumran, and they find these jars, and in these jars they find scrolls. This translation on page 64 that goes a couple pages, that is the best translation of Isaiah 53 that I could come up with. So, I mean, it's the best translation to English. Isaiah 53 is extremely important. If you were a first century Jew who studied the Torah, that would be extremely important. This foretells what's supposed to happen. And then on page 65, and these don't do justice to the letters, but you're going to get summaries of Paul's letters, and it's very brief, and it's just gives you an idea. So you'll have that. And then finally on the last page, you see kind of a diagram, and the diagram is what happened to the apostles, okay? And I want to talk about, I'm going to go back to Genghis Khan. So, look at Thomas. It says Thomas, he was killed by a spear, and he dies in India. Steve did a sermon on that, okay, that he died in India. the significant thing about that is Thomas doesn't go into the Roman Empire. He goes outside the Roman Empire. How's that tie into Genghis Khan? I promise you, I'm reading a book, and it's not a Christian book, it's a book, a biography of Genghis Khan. And it takes place, say, in the mid-1100s to, in that time frame. And Genghis is dealing with various religions, okay? So whatever the mongrels worship, right? And then he had Chinese, right? Eventually he would have to deal with people who were in the Islamic faith. And of course, in his conquering and stuff, he ran into people of the Jewish faith, but there were Christian mongrels. Now you go figure that out. Christian mongrels. I mean, when I read it, it was like, how? You know where Mongolia is? You know where Mongolia is? It's north of China. It's like yeah. So anyway, it's around Korea and Soviet Union. It goes back to Thomas. I mean, non-religious historians will tell you he was there, and that's how Christianity got up there, for real. And so when I was doing the Genghis Khan thing, which led into a book about Kublai Khan, I started thinking, that got me thinking. That's kind of where it originally started. Now, go down and look at Peter. I went to Rome, and Heather and I went to the site where they say Peter's buried. And you're going like, how do you know he's there? Well, apparently they've done some things that they can identify things under the ground. And they have this monument. And what they told me, there is a, whatever you want to call it, a burial spot in the middle under this big ornate thing. And then everybody that's buried around him are pointed towards this one grave. So that kind of, maybe he is buried there, right? With Paul, nobody can tell you how Paul died. He could have died in his sleep. There's no answer. There's speculation. And the speculation about Paul is maybe he got beheaded. And but again, there's no proof. But this tells you where he's buried. Now, I also wanted to bring up Andrew. Heather and I went to Scotland, and the Scots claim, it says here that he's buried in Italy, Andrew, okay? And the Scots claim they got some of his bones. Thus, St. Andrews, the golf course, and all that. Because I'm being serious. Somehow, some of the bones of St. Andrew got to Scotland. So those are the only four I wanted to bring to your attention because I had some kind of experience with them. So that's what happened to the apostles. So what I'd like to do now is just say, what do you hope to learn from studying Paul? And to me, because my minor in college was history, so I'm trying to give you background into the history of Paul. I'm not going to give you like a dissertation on every one of the letters and it means this and so on and so forth. Because quite frankly, what you think it means it might not be what it means at all, why he was writing these letters. The question, why did he write these letters? We'll get into that. The most interesting thought-provoking question was, why did Christ pick Paul? I mean, really. And maybe we'll figure that out. Now, if we go to the second page, the question is, who was the Apostle Paul? And Paul is a contradiction. but I hope to be able to explain why we think he's a contradiction and what changed his life. Paul is a persecutor of Christians, right? We all know that. But then you flip it, and he's an apostle to the Gentiles. He talks, as a matter of fact, about how he studied all of the Old Testament, and he was an expert in it. And that's why he persecuted the Christians, and we'll get into that in a minute. But then you flip it again, and he views Christ as the fulfillment of all the prophecies in the Old Testament. He was a writer, obviously. He was a philosopher. And you think about how much did Paul write? Well, I don't know if you know this, but there are letters that he wrote. They're just gone. We don't know where they're at. But consider this, that if you take all of the letters that Paul wrote and you put them on paper like this, you got 80 pages. That's it. And then you compare that to some of the great philosophers who is just volumes and volumes of stuff. If you took the Gospels and put them on paper, you got 40 pages, okay? So the interesting thing about Paul is, here's a guy that we don't have a lot of his writings, but if you just look at him as a philosopher, he's more well known than anyone, literally. So that's kind of interesting right there. We don't think of at the point he's doing his various trips, Paul's homeless. He really is. He's not at home. He doesn't have a wife. He's homeless. He'll create these little cells in Asia Minor and in Greece, and that had already started in Rome. But those little cells turn into churches that turn into the Christian faith. They say, if not for Paul, Christianity would be some offshoot of Judaism, period. So that's how important Paul was. When Paul finally, and we'll get into it, when he's on a boat that takes him to Rome, by the time he gets to Rome, he's already sent the letter to the Romans, but by the time he lands at the bottom where they landed from Malta into Italy, people would come up and just greet him like he was like a hero coming home. They never met him, never heard him, never seen him. But they knew who he was before he got there. The most significant thing is, think of the book of Acts, right? What's the book of Acts about? Yeah, but it starts with Christ is talking to the disciples and so on and so forth, right? Well, depending on the date that you say that occurred and the date that the book of Acts ends, it's give or take, let's call it 34 years. Not a long time, okay? And it goes from being just, really, seriously, just a small group of people to that when he lands in Italy, they know who he is, okay? And he preaches in Italy freely, openly, okay? So that's a remarkable thing. Paul, in the physical sense, unlike the other apostles, never knew Christ. And that'll cause friction as we study it. Because people are going like, you didn't know him, you know. And so he never knew him. But in his lifetime, he'll surpass all of them. Peter, all of them. He was faced with, from believers, from his fellow believers, he was faced with criticism, jealousy, and by threats, I mean, from everything you can imagine. That's from the good guys, not the bad guys. There's a verse and I'm going to read you this verse in the context of this is the life he chose. Please don't interpret what I'm going to read to you as there's a reason he's writing what I read, but I'm just trying to point out that he chose a life that was hard, and this is what he says. This is 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 25. He goes, I have worked harder. I have been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten by rods. That was probably Romans. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, dangers from bandits, dangers from my fellow Jews, dangers from Gentiles, dangers in the city, danger in the country, danger at sea, danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and I've been naked. And he chose that. So, a real interesting quote about Paul, and as you can imagine, he's gone through a lot, so he's probably carrying a lot of scars. But one of the things I found interesting is you get into Galatians, he says, I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. What does that mean? Paul was not let's name somebody today in the world who's an extraordinary speaker. Just name anybody. Doesn't matter. Who's a great speaker? Obama, the first time I heard Obama, I thought, that is an extraordinary speaker. First time I heard it, he is. Who else is an extraordinary speaker? Oprah. Okay, okay.
This guy right here.
Steve's going, not so much with the Oprah. Steve. Oh, I'm sorry, why didn't I say that from the beginning? An extraordinary speaker like Steve. But what I'm trying to get across is Paul is not an extraordinary speaker. And you're going to find out that there's other people who come after him who talk better, and the people follow those people. But the one thing about Paul is he speaks boldly, very boldly. The one thing about Paul is, I'm going to give you an example. There's going to be in our study, there's going to be a story where Paul has to get on a boat. And the boat has to go from, the Asian coast to Rome. Okay, he gets on the boat, and then they get another boat, and he tells them, he goes, at this time of year, it's not a good idea to be going that way. And they talk it out, and I'll get into all the ins and outs about that conversation, and we're going to do it. And then it gets really bad. And Paul is the kind of guy who says, I told you so. And you can read it. He says it. That's Paul. He'll get in I'll tell you a story where he gets in Peter's face, and he's brutal. So he really believes in what he's saying, and he didn't take the Dale Carnegie course. He just says it, right? And a lot of times that gets him in trouble. So, if you go to the next page, there's a lot of talk about we'll make it real big, but you have a small copy. There's a lot of talk about what Paul looked like. There is this is not in the Bible, but there is an account when he's on a missionary trip and he's in Asia Minor and he comes to a town, and there's a person who is said to have described him, okay? And that description was short, bald, bow-legged, kind of stocky, a very, very large nose. And so in this fresco that you're looking at, this is the 4th century. And they have him with a very thin face and the beard, but they have him bald. And something that when you research, there's just speculation, but there's a lot of talk that he might have been thin up top. When we get into the book of Acts, I just want to tell you that if we are reading and Luke says the word "we," that means he was with Paul. Okay. Now, if you go to page 5, these are the different places that Paul would have sent letters to the various churches. And it gives the dates. And again, these dates are going to fluctuate based on who you read and so on and so forth. N.T. Wright will tell you that the first person to write about Jesus Christ within a generation was Paul. Dallas Theological Seminary said not James was the first one. So, but very early on, Paul is like the source of what happened. Then I give you all the books that Paul wrote. I know that when I was growing up, they attributed Hebrews to him. I think most people now think he did not write Hebrews. Then, I keep talking about Dallas Theological Seminary. Then I give you a chronological breakdown of what happens by year. And you're going to see that I tell you that Jesus was not born in the year 1. He was born in the year 4 BC. The reason it's 4 BC, he was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Herod the Great dies in 4 BC. The reason these dates are going to become important is because Paul's going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to make some observations about things that could have occurred when he was in Jerusalem. But if you just look at these real briefly, Jesus was born in 4 BC. If we do the math correctly, some people think Jesus dies in 30 AD. Some people say it's 31 AD. Early 30 AD, Jesus was crucified. Something that this whole thing about crucifixion. This is a nasty, nasty death. I mean, you think you know how nasty it is. Let me tell you how nasty it was. They could get a guy on a cross and crucify him and put him up like this, and he could last for days. And he's just in pain, and then they talk about animals would come, birds, dogs. It's the most disgusting way to die. It was horrible. I was reading today, some Roman philosophers were just, I guess they're ahead of their time. They said, we shouldn't be doing this. This is just horrible, So it was really, really bad way to die. It was, I know that when Jesus is on the cross, they say there's, these thieves, right? But generally speaking, people who were put on the cross would be slaves and rebels. That's what you did it for. And it was, if you're a rebel, it was to say, we put you at the same level as a slave, which is as far down on the food chain as possible. Put you up there and leave you up there. So anyway, it's a bad way to die. And if we go on to page 7, you're going to see that they think the book of James is written somewhere in the mid to late 40s AD. The Catholics will tell you that this is another James. Protestants believe it's James, the brother of Jesus. It's kind of interesting that maybe he becomes a believer after, not during. So, but he becomes very important in the early Christian church, the church that's in Jerusalem. They think maybe around 50 AD, give or take, maybe the Gospel of Matthew is written. Then they say Paul starts writing 50, 54, and then it's just when he wrote different letters and the dates that go with them. Then finally, you're going to see the last one in our list is going to be the book of Hebrews, which was probably written, he was probably dead when that book was written. We're going to talk about the dates around Paul's birth. Here's a map. Next page. That's a map of Turkey, and if you look, let me show you. Look right here. This would be Tarsus. Tarsus is a very important city. Something that most people don't know. About 100 years before Paul is born, there's a war in that area. And all the philosophers in Athens, well, the city of Athens took the wrong side in the war. So all the philosophers that were in Athens go to Tarsus, get away from the fighting. So there's a heavy concentration of Greek philosophy in Tarsus. Okay, Paul is exposed to this. All the great philosophers, he would have been exposed to that his whole life. Tarsus is a major city. Goes without saying, I think his name is Paulus, P-A, it's got an O-S on the end, that would be the Greek, and his Jewish name is Saul. He's born a Roman citizen, which is the best part of it about being a Roman citizen, he can't be crucified. That's a law. So there's other good parts, but that's a biggie when you know about the crucifixion part. He was well versed in many languages. He speaks Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and some think he could speak Latin. He probably goes through an apprenticeship through his father, and that's where he learns the profession of tent making. And in 1 Corinthians, he talks about that they work very hard with their hands. So getting into the learning his dad's profession, he would have been in the commerce of doing tents for different people. He could have done tents for Roman soldiers. He would have done tents for Greeks. He would have done tents for Jewish people. And these people a lot of these people there's a lot of movement going on. So tents were very, very important. And tents is a very good profession because you really don't need a lot. So if you're on the road, you can still make tents, and that's what he did. A lot of people think that, the interesting thing about Paul, a lot of people think Paul went on these trips and, it was all paid for, and he worked. I mean, he worked a profession, and he preached the gospel. So, and he could preach. Sometimes you think Steve goes long. There'll be a story where Paul's just going all night long, and a guy sitting in the window at whatever time in the morning falls out of the window because he fell asleep. He just goes that long. So anyway, his father is a Pharisee. So y'all tell me, what's a Pharisee? I mean, you read in the Gospels that the Pharisees and Jesus and so on and so forth. What's a Pharisee? Legalistic. Obeyed the law. Okay? What else? Let me ask you this. Were there a lot of Pharisees? Nobody wants to guess? You could either say there were a lot, or maybe there weren't so many. You say, okay, well, Josephus, who's a historian, says that there were about 6,000 in the first century. And the Pharisees are legalistic in that they believe the law of God. And they're very pious, and they're really into rituals. And there can be different Pharisees. There can be Pharisees who are like extreme, and there can be Pharisees who are like open-minded. And you're gonna see that. Generally, a Pharisee should be a pretty good person, high moral character. His father is a Pharisee. By the age of 5, maybe his mother is teaching him just the basics, reading and being able to study scripture. By 10, he'll be studying under his father. From 10 to say 13, his father is passing on the whole concept of being a Pharisee and Jewish law and so on and so forth. Everybody knows what the Torah is. What's the Torah? First 5 books of the Bible. So he'll be well into his studies about the Torah by the time he's 13. Interesting thing you're going to find out about Paul is if you go to Romans 16:7, you're going to find that he has relatives who became Christians before he did. That's interesting, isn't it? If a Jewish, I was going to say Jewish boy, but you're not. At 13, you're a man. By the time you're 13, you are expected to know if your father had a trade. You're supposed to. You had been apprenticed and you know his job. Okay, 13. So if you're a Jewish boy at 13, your father's a Pharisee, and you want to do further study, you would be mentored by a rabbi, right? And this would probably take you from 14 to 20 and really get into it. So when we talk about Paul, let's just say when in the book of Acts, it talks about Paul goes to Jerusalem. And when Paul went to Jerusalem, he could have been 14. Okay? And I give you I misspelled the rabbi's name, but the correct spelling of the rabbi's name that he studied under is Gamaliel. And he was a great rabbi. And there'll be a section in the book of Acts where 2 of the apostles are being tried by the Sanhedrin. And this man is the one who says, if, these people are not from God, we've seen them before, they come, they go. If they are from God, there's nothing you guys can do to stop them. So he's very open-minded. This man is a teaching rabbi, probably from the years 22 AD, maybe to 55 AD. That becomes significant because Paul's not going to be in this neck of the woods in 55. Probably, well, maybe when some bad things happen. So this 22 is important, okay? So Paul, even though he's taught under a very wise and rabbi, this rabbi is revered by Jews today. Great rabbi who was open-minded, and he's a Pharisee. This guy's a Pharisee, open-minded, right? Paul kind of goes radical, okay? And he's, no. Everybody's got to adhere to the law, and to the point, if he felt, the people that he hung around with felt like you were really a danger, they would take it to the point to kill you, which they weren't allowed to do. A Jew can't kill somebody in Palestine, Israel at that point in time. Roman could, not a Jew. But they were fanatical, this sect. So when you think of Pharisees, there's Pharisees, and let's just say there's liberal Pharisees and there's conservative Pharisees. So we'll put him on the far edge of that. 13?
Yeah, but did they do that then?
Yeah.
So this is way back.
Sure.
Was that, did I go to?
Where are you at?
This is the next page.
Yeah, okay. Wait, are you on page?
This is page 11.
Page 11, okay. Now, let me get into the Pharisee. And I'm going to ask Steve this question. Because he might be over there going, cut. When you study this stuff, there are different periods of time. And one period of time is called, this period is called First Temple. And the first temple was built by Solomon. The second temple is built, and we were there, in Israel, by Herod the Great, right? Okay. If you go to Ezekiel 10, let me get into the temple. Temple is a place on earth where God and earth are together. He's there, right? He's there. In Ezekiel 10, okay, which is probably 500 years before Paul, God leaves the temple. Okay? And he don't come back. If you study the second temple, there's no reference to God coming back. Now, how does this fit in with Paul? God left the temple because people were disobedient and so on and so forth. And this is a tradition that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. I give you paradise. It's all there. It's just perfect, And what did they do? They sinned. Now you got to work and toil and all that kind of stuff. And that's the history. When he has the first temple, the Babylonians come, they go into exile and so on and so forth. God leaves the temple because they had a place in the temple which is called the Holy of the Holies. And in that spot, that's where God came. And in Ezekiel, it talks about God leaves. He don't come back. If you're a Pharisee, you think, the reason God hasn't come back is because we're not following his laws. And if we start following his laws, he'll come back to the temple. Okay? That's what Paul believed. And Paul believed, like, if I really take it to an extreme, like some of my buddies, that'll bring God back sooner. So that's what he believed. Okay? Oh, well, I was going to ask Steve, have you ever heard about God leaving the temple? Okay.
Of course. Yeah.
He, by the way, the Pharisees were so conservative in terms of bringing God back to the temple. That's the timing why Jesus came at that particular time. He came when the Pharisees were at their pinnacle. They started out, they were called the Tanyanim and the Sophrim, way back in the Old Testament, around the book of Judges. And that was the beginning of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Sadducees were basically lawyers, and the Pharisees were theologians, so to speak. And they had risen to quite a little bit of power when Jesus came.
So, I was talking about dates. If you go to, who's a good reader? Not everybody at once. Who's a good reader? Heather? Oh, Donna's a good reader. Read Acts 7:54 through 60. (54 through 60).
I got it if you
You guys
want
with me?
to.
Go ahead, you read it.
Go ahead. I didn't know if you wanted someone else or not.
The Jewish leaders were infuriated by Stephen's accusation, and they shook their fists at him in rage. Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed steadily into heaven and saw the glory of God. And he saw Jesus standing in the place of honor at God's right hand. And he told them, "Look, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing in the place of honor at God's right hand." Then they put their hands over their ears and began shouting. They rushed at him and dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. His accusers took off their coats and laid them at the feet of a young man named Saul.
That was Paul, the young man. He could have been a teenager. Okay? So Paul witnesses this, and he's all for it because he's on the extreme group, or the extreme side of the whole Pharisee philosophy. Okay? So he's there. Now, depending on when we say Christ is crucified, if it's 30 AD or 31 or whatever, there's a very good chance Paul was in Jerusalem. Okay? Because his rabbi was teaching from 22 to 55. This occurs at 30. Okay? So then you go like, well, did he see it? Nothing written about that. He never, well, there's some lost letters, but he never mentions it, right? You go, well, if, the real question is, if he was there, how could he miss it? Does everybody agree with that? What if the city of Jerusalem was really a city of so big, and when you had like a big festival or a feast observance or something, the city grew by hundreds of thousands. Heather and I were in, we're in Scotland, Edinburgh, and it usually has a population of, let's say it's 100,000, but they are having some festival there and it was 400,000. Okay? So what if Paul is in Jerusalem and the population's grown by hundreds of thousands. Could he have been there? Yes. Could he have missed it? Yes. But he never mentions it. It's never mentioned. But that's something we don't think about. The one thing I'm trying to get across is he's younger than Christ. Okay? Not the same age. Now, if you go to the next page, and we make the map real big, everybody, I think, knows the story. I think everybody knows the story of the conversion on the road to Damascus. Okay. Now, this is a map that would show you going from Jerusalem to Damascus. Okay. Now, there's a lot of the academic types just sit around and think about stuff all day. And, there's some people who say that if he was on a donkey or whatever he was on, he was meditating about, something, and, that's when it happened, and whatever. But what we do know is that he's going from Jerusalem to Damascus to do bad things to followers of Christ. We know that. And he was totally bought into that. So in Galatians 1:13 through 14, he talks about how what a bad guy he was about persecuting them. He says he was an extremist about it, zealous about the tradition of his fathers, and this whole thing about if we can make everybody obey the laws and stuff, we'll get God to come back, and they thought we'll get God to come back, and then in the first century they had thoughts of a Messiah coming back, but they'd had false messiahs before the birth of Christ, after the birth of Christ. They've had false, but if you're a Pharisee, the Messiah that you see is God coming back, taking these pagans who are ruling your country and suddenly wiping them out and restoring this to a kingdom of God, and life's great again. That's what they were hoping for, right? Nothing like a Jesus type who's not violent. He's so many of the things. Just want to get back into the what a first century Jew would think about. When Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, where does that come from? It comes from the book of Daniel. If you were well versed in your scriptures, when he made these comments, you knew what he was talking about. He comes into Jerusalem on a colt. So it's been prophesied, So, but for Paul, it's all about God kicking pagans out, God's in control, we're back to where we should be. And the only way to do that is if I see people who, this is what he's thinking. You have you're taking our faith and you're doing what people did for centuries, and that made God leave the temple. You guys are wrong. I'm not wrong. You're wrong. And that's why we're in this mess. And we got the Romans, with their hands around our throat. You guys are messing it up. We're going to take care of you guys to make things right. Okay? So, on the road to Damascus in Acts 9, it talks about he encounters a light. Okay, we've all heard it. And in that, he hears a voice. Now, the interesting thing about when he hears the voice, he responds to the voice by addressing the voice as Lord. So he's aware that there's something, God things happening to him. Okay? Now, he'll talk about this later, but this light and this conversation that he has from Christ, and then the loss of his eyesight from the light, and he hears the words, and the most important thing to take away from the conversion on the road to Damascus is, number one, that he recognizes what's happening is from God. Okay? He doesn't fight it. And that this revelation that's made to Paul is not made by men telling him. It's coming directly from Jesus Christ. This will become a very, very big sticking point for the rest of his career, because people, there'll be rumors that'll go around saying, he picked that up from the disciples in Jerusalem. That's where he got that story, and he'll have to fight that. And he'll go to great lengths saying that this revelation wasn't from those guys. I didn't need those guys. This came from Jesus directly to me. Okay? He talks that when this happens, he is taken to a third heaven. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, you ever heard the whole thing about seventh heaven? Not the TV show, but it's like if you're in the seventh heaven, it's the best heaven, right? Well, some people would speculate that there's there's different levels of heaven, okay, like 7 levels of heaven. Other people speculate that the third level of heaven, it can be explained by reading the book of Genesis. The creation, the heavens and the earth, and so the sky and the cosmos, and maybe that's the third heaven. But he tells you that when he goes to this third heaven, he is told things that he cannot repeat to men. So whatever happens is all that he's been taught, and all he knows is that God is, for some reason, talking to him and saying, in this case, Jesus, why are you persecuting me? And it's like, he's got to be totally dumbfounded. What does this mean, right? But he does recognize the voice that he's talking to as the Lord. Okay. So he will go from this experience on the road, and then the men who are with him, they see him, they don't hear what happens. He's taken to Damascus, and he's taken to the house of a Jewish person there, and it's on a street, and it's called Straight Street. And if you go home and Google it, and it has a Arab name to it now, but it's still there. This Straight Street. And he goes there, and he doesn't eat, and he doesn't drink, and it's like he's just, for 3 days, and it's like, I'm trying to figure out what happened to me. Now, Jesus had said many times that to to the Pharisees, actually. He said, you got it wrong. You don't understand what God's saying, At one point, he'll compare them to being like tombs full of bugs, and, just all kinds of nasty stuff. You're not getting it, And so Paul's in a very confused state at this point in time. But Paul will tell you when this is over that when he was in his mother's womb, this was decided. He would be different. So we always hear about John the Baptist, that John the Baptist had the Spirit of the Lord when he was in his mother's womb. Remember, he jumps for joy when he hears the voice of Mary. Jesus calls John the Baptist the greatest prophet, greater than all of those before him, right? So when he goes to Damascus, then God is going to speak to a man who is a believer in Damascus, and his name is Ananias. And Ananias gets the good news that you need to go speak with Paul. Well, Ananias knows the guy's reputation. Really? Yeah, you need to go. And so Ananias will go when he has this vision. He's told to go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man named Saul of Tarsus. And that's in Acts 9:10 through 19. And it says he was very afraid, but he obeyed the Lord anyway, because it was revealed to him that Saul had been chosen by God, not by men. And that's in Ephesians, and it's also in Colossians, it's also in Acts, and it's in Galatians. So he goes to the street, and then I give you the name of the street if you look it up if you Google it. And he meets with Saul, and Saul is baptized by Ananias. And he places hands on Saul, and his sight returns. And from this point, we're not going to use the word Saul anymore. We're just going to exclusively use the word Paul. Ananias calls him brother. So Brother Bob, why do I call him Brother Bob? Because we have a common faith, and in our faith, we are brothers and sisters in Christ. Ananias says to Paul, brother. So we're now of the same faith. Paul will spend a little bit of time in Damascus after this. It's a life-changing experience. But the real interesting part comes next. If you go to the next page, in Galatians, when you read the book of Acts, I said this at the very beginning, Acts is something that's like 34 years long. So Luke is trying to put the history of the church very quickly into one book, right? And this happened, but his dates might not jive, because Luke writes Acts. Maybe he writes Acts when Paul is, he's putting it together when Paul thinks he's going to go to trial in front of Nero. But he's putting these things together, but then Paul's writing these letters, and some of these letters don't jive with the dates that Luke was saying. But the bottom line is, if you read Acts, this is what happens. Paul goes to the road, Paul's converted, he goes to Damascus, he runs around to some synagogues, it's Jesus, 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 and then he goes back to Jerusalem. That's not what happens. Paul has the conversion, he goes to Damascus, he tries to absorb all this stuff, Then he goes to Arabia for 3 years. He says it. He said, if you go to Galatians 1:15, he said he did it. Then there's a whole question, did he go to Arabia? Was he really talking about Arabia? If you look at the map, there's a nation, and it's outlined here. And that's a pretty good chunk of what is now Jordan and Arabia. The capital of this nation is Petra. That's the capital of this nation. So some scholars say, well, what happened? This is what happened. Paul has this conversion, and then he goes in this neighboring country, and he preaches, what he's had this conversion about. And that's what happens for 3 years. And then when he thinks he's got it right, then he'll go back to Damascus, and that's where Luke picks it up again, all right? Other people say that Paul goes to Arabia, and Paul specifically goes to Mount Sinai, and he goes to Mount Sinai why? What happened there?
It's the best hospital around.
It's the best hospital around, but beside it being a great hospital, what happened at Mount Sinai in the Old Testament? Okay, but what happened at Mount Sinai? Moses got the 10 Commandments. There you go. Saw God. Steve might not agree with this, but he did, and his face was affected from it.
Is that right?
Yeah, you're right. So let me show you where Mount Sinai is. Here's the nation I'm talking about. Mount Sinai would be down about here. This whole area is called Sinai. Okay. So when we went to Israel, you'll remember that they took us to a spot where Elijah takes on the priest of Baal. I always say Baal, it's Baal. You remember that? And, who can make it rain and so on and so forth. And he triumphs over them. And a large number of them are killed. And so after that happens to Elijah, he went to Mount Sinai for 40 days. And he talks to God. Okay? And what I'm saying is that Paul, being a great student, he would have known about, obviously, Moses being there and all the great things there, but he would have known about Elijah, right? And some say he goes to Mount Sinai to talk to God and say, okay, I'm just trying to get this right. Now, what does this all mean? And over the period of 3 years, he's told what happened to him and what it means. And that what you thought was an attack on your religion is really a fulfillment of prophecy. And it's fulfilled through Jesus Christ, who taught you up there.